Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this Lowy Institute event with our 2026 Rothschild and Co-Distinguished International Fellow, Steve Biegun. Let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this theatre stands. I'm Michael Fullilove. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute. Welcome everybody. Especially warm welcomes to some old friends of the Institute, the Lions, supporters of ours, Martine Letts, a former Deputy Director of the Institute, Susanna Patton, a former Program Director, a Deputy Research Director of the Institute, who's just moved to Melbourne and is going to be joining the Institute as a non-resident fellow. So get all your Southeast Asia opinions from Susanna. So welcome, a warm welcome to everybody. We love being back in this great city of ideas. We sat down at the end of last year and we said to ourselves, what is going to be the big story of the world in 2026? And we decided maybe that Mr. Trump and America might play some sort of role in the global discussion. And so we've put on a program this year, in the first half of this year, of 3 distinguished Americans who can help us as a country to decode what is happening in the United States. Last month we had Eli Ratner, who's I guess a conservative Democrat who was the key Asia-Pacific official in President Biden's Pentagon, who spoke here and in Sydney and in Canberra. In May we're going to have Tom Wright, a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute, who was a senior official in President Biden's NSC, who's writing a book for us called Inflection Point. And this month we have Steve Biegun with us, with his wife Adelaide. And I'll come back to Steve and introduce him properly in a minute. But it was important to us that at a time when Australia is really grappling with America, with our alliance relationship with the United States, that we have people who can speak to us authoritatively on that topic. Of course, since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most powerful country in the world, and it has retained a hold on the world's imagination. At the end of the Second World War, Washington built a new kind of order defined by shared norms such as democratic government and economic liberalism, and embedded in alliances, agreements, and multilateral institutions. American statesmen achieved what historian John Lewis Gaddis described as hegemony by consent. Hegemony by consent. It was, of course, America's preponderant economic weight and its blue water navy and its hard power was a part of its hegemony, but the consent was also a part of the hegemony. Friends of the United States could see a place for themselves in Washington's worldview, and so I think that made it much easier for the United States to maintain its position. And one of the things that Steve will talk about tonight is about those institutions and about those alliances and friendships. Now, in this part of the world, the United States, since the Second World War, has provided structure and balance to the region. It's often said that the most important bilateral relationship in the world is that between the United States and China. It's often said that China is America's pacing threat, that the future of the world will be made in the Indo-Pacific. And this is another one of the questions that I'm going to discuss with Steve tonight. Is that still the case? Because it is certainly still the case that Asia is often pushed off the American agenda. At the beginning of the year, when Steve and I agreed that he and Adelaide would come and visit us, I don't think we could have predicted that he would be visiting 3.5 weeks into a major war in the Middle East. We probably thought we'd be talking much more about the Indo-Pacific than he has in this trip. Asia experts in Washington often say they feel like Michael Corleone in Godfather Part 3. You remember when Michael Corleone is trying to go legitimate, and he says, every time I think I'm out, they drag me back in. And often Asia experts in Washington feel like that. Just when the world is focusing, when America is starting to focus its efforts on Asia, the Middle East drags the United States back in. So tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from an American policymaker who can talk to us about those 2 issues, about the global order that Washington created with its allies and friends after the Second World War and what's going to happen to it in the future. And secondly, what does it mean for this part of the world? Steve has served in senior positions in the US government and the private sector, many positions. He was Chief of Staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was the National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader, Executive Secretary of the NSC, Deputy to the NSA. He was also a Vice President with Ford and with Boeing. And in the first Trump administration, he served as Deputy Secretary of State. So for a number of years, he was a senior in the Trump administration, and for that last period, he served as the number 2 official in the State Department. So unlike, I think, anybody else in the room, Steve has worked closely with President Trump, has seen how he operates how he operates as a president, different from other presidents that Steve has served. And I think he is the perfect person to help us decode what is happening. So we will have a conversation up here. I want to go to you all and give you an opportunity to put a question to Steve Biegun. But first of all, I'm going to invite him to the lectern to make some prepared remarks. Steve, welcome.
Evening. Well, thank you, Michael. That was a very generous introduction. Truth be known, it was the second best introduction that I've received this year. The first was about a month ago. I was speaking at another event and the moderator was late and I had to introduce myself. Now that was a great introduction. In all seriousness, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Lowy Institute, and I want to thank you, fine citizens of Melbourne, for coming out this evening to hear my thoughts. I hope we can make this a conversation at the end, and Michael and I will stay here to be part of that discussion. If you spent any time looking at my background before this event, you would have seen that I'm a native of the city of Detroit, Michigan. If you looked closely, you'd see that while I did serve in the United States government as a diplomat and as an international advisor for 20 years, I also spent 2 decades working in the private sector. And if you really read the fine print in my background, you would have seen that the longest stretch of employment I ever enjoyed was with Ford Motor Company. Ford Motor Company was a big part of my life from the very beginning. It was not uncommon, as was the case with me, that I was the 3rd generation of my family to work for that company. My great-grandfather was a blacksmith. He left the coal mines of Pennsylvania in 1915 to bend metal for Henry Ford's new horseless carriage, the Model T, which combined with modern manufacturing, revolutionized transportation in the United States and around the world. His son, my grandfather, dropped out of organized schooling in the 8th grade and was instead trained at Ford Motor Company's vocational program. He became a master mechanic, the best I ever met in my life. And from his success, he was able to send his son, my father, to an engineering university as the first college-educated member of my family. And it was in all of their footsteps that I followed to Ford Motor Company more than 20 years ago. But I arrived at a very different place in the company. College educated and steeped in international experience, I was hired as a corporate vice president and one of the most senior executives at Ford Motor Company. I, the great-grandson of a Polish immigrant named Carol Biegun, who had worked in Henry Ford's factory, was now a peer of the CEO of Ford Motor Company, himself the great-grandson of Henry Ford. In just 3 generations, our family moved from the coal mines to the factory, to the university, and finally to the C-suite. Sadly, the plants in which my grandfather and great-grandfather spent so many years have all been closed. And I'm sure this is a story that is familiar to many families here in Melbourne, as the history of the automobile and manufacturing in general in Australia played a similar role in the development of this economy. And Ford Motor Company has been an enormous part of that history right here in Melbourne. Ford Motor Company entered Australia in 1925 It launched the Broadmeadows plant in Melbourne in 1956, and over the next half century, the plant went on to employ tens of thousands of men and women across generations. These people worked hard, and they were proud of the work that they did. However, in 2013, the company made the very difficult decision to end the manufacturing of automobiles in Australia altogether. Perhaps the decline of the industry was inevitable, perhaps not, but nobody needs to explain to a son of Detroit what was lost. The closure of Broadmeadows was the end of an era, but this was more than a history of industry. It's a personal story for the thousands of men and women who made their livelihoods within it and whose jobs supported their families. I share this background as a point of departure to at least partially understand the context of the elections in the United States of America in 2016 and in 2024. More than 70 million voters in each of those elections voted for a very different kind of American president. There are many Americans who now rightly question if it would any longer be possible for a family across 3 generations to move from the coal mine to corporate leadership. It should not surprise us that this would have a political manifestation as well, and one that contributed to President Trump's election in 2016, when he simultaneously transformed and seized control of the conservative movement in the United States. President Trump's nostalgia to return to a glorious past, whether accurate or even possible, matched the mood of many Americans in places like Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Irish author Patrick McTagg calls this a conservatism guided by loss. President Trump's call to make America great again, his demand for America first, in both a genius and genuine way, captured that zeitgeist. And as the old saying goes, elections have consequences. President Trump has long expressed the view that the global trading system was unfair to the United States. At his direction, American trade policy is going through dramatic changes in ways that have a huge impact on trading partners around the world, including here in Australia. The Trump administration has 3 basic goals. The first is to protect US-based manufacturers across a large swath of industries. The tool being used to do this is the imposition of steep tariffs on global imports, combined with lower duties in the hope of greater exports of US goods abroad. Second, the president has directed his negotiators to leverage commitments from US trading partners to invest substantial sums in the United States of America. And third, the United States has looked in particular at how to partner with other countries to unlock sources of the critical minerals that are necessary to support modern technology, especially those outside the control of China. And I cannot exaggerate how much China's economic rise and its economic policies have exacerbated all of these concerns. Starting in the 1990s, the world experienced what was perhaps the greatest advance of human liberty and prosperity in all of history. In quick succession, we saw the collapse of governments that were founded upon and sustained in power by communism, totalitarianism, and authoritarianism. Along with this advancement of human liberty came new opportunities in the global economy for the movement of goods through ever freer trade and investment flows across newly opened borders. This free trade and investment created enormous wealth around the world, raising people out of poverty in what were once historically underdeveloped parts of the world, and in the case of China, creating the greatest generational economic advancement in history. There were some hiccups along the way for the United States. Factories closed and manufacturing declined. The US trade deficit ballooned to hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And the 2008 global financial crisis soured the views of many on the more reckless behaviors that were born out of the free flow of money. As a consequence, this period is remembered less for the prosperity that it brought than for the excesses that it gave birth to, in particular after China entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the year 2000. And then the backlash formed. America undeniably became rich from these years, but not all Americans became rich. Inequities between rich and poor, economic dislocation, the loss of manufacturing jobs to automation and improved competition, and the attendant social ills that flowed from all of this combined to build a powerful undercurrent of discontent. As odd as it may seem for a billionaire to connect to these grievances, this is exactly the political fodder that fueled President Trump's first election in 2016. And this was not new to him. Since the 1980s, he has raged against imported goods like automobiles. He has complained that America's trading partners were unfair and that trade flows were unbalanced. He powerfully connected with those parts of the nation that felt injured, neglected, and ignored. For Australia and for other countries throughout the Pacific and Asia, our election has led to wrenching changes in trade and investment rules. Stretching the reach of his executive powers, the president has significantly expanded tariffs in order to defeat the very forces of globalization that are blamed by him and so many others for these ills. It's fair to say that the most dire predictions from economists about the negative consequences of these policies have not yet come true. But I think it's also fair to say that there's not yet been any evidence that these policies have achieved their objective either. As for what to expect on trade, the recent curtailment by the United States Supreme Court of the president's authorities to quickly and unilaterally impose tariffs will probably create a bit more predictability now and even certainty for America's trading partners in the Indo-Pacific. And on a positive note, deeper investment in technology cooperation such as AI, quantum computing, fusion, critical minerals, and the exploration of outer space offer new opportunities for win-win outcomes that might render those trade disputes obsolete, especially here in Australia. It's unrealistic to expect anytime soon a new burst of energy for free trade negotiations, but I don't think I'm being overly optimistic when I say that America will be back at the table before too long. And when that day comes, with the future elimination of tariffs, there will be ample leverage to establish a deep and wide-ranging set of trade agreements on a fair and mutually beneficial basis. That too will be good for Australia, it'll be good for our trading partners in Asia, and it'll be good for America. There are, of course, many other discontents beyond trade policy that are roiling American politics, including immigration, new technologies such as artificial intelligence, and the modern ways we communicate and consume information, including social media and the internet. But in my remaining remarks, I just want to touch on one other issue that connects the current trends in the United States with important priorities for the Indo-Pacific region. And this is our alliances and institutions and the security that has flowed from them. If the president struck a nerve with the American people on trade, his second powerful argument that animated the 2024 presidential election was the complaint that the United States was overburdened with military deployments and security guarantees around the world. Those arguments were fueled by this century's long, costly, and inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also underpinned his criticism of the billions of dollars of support for Ukraine to defend itself against Russia's brutal invasion. These wars are caricatured in the United States as forever wars, peripheral to America's interests, and perpetuated by an imagined class of warmongering so-called neoconservatives or neocons. Time will tell, but the military actions in the past 3 months in Venezuela and Iran may be turning those arguments on their head. One area in which Asia has been spared some of the challenges faced by Europe is President Trump's challenge to global institutions. There simply is nothing like NATO or the European Union in the Indo-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, APEC, is a loose association most important for its convening ability across this vast Pacific region. ASEAN, likewise, does not bind American interests in any way. For better or for worse, the Indo-Pacific is largely devoid of regional institutions that seek to advance normative values like human rights, democracy, or even security. There is, of course, the Quad, with Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, and there's AUKUS, which ties together Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom in the cooperative development of nuclear-powered submarines and other future technologies. It is good news that the importance of these groupings of nations have been reaffirmed by the Trump administration, but these too are relatively loose or limited constructs. Mostly, America's security relationships in the region are on a bilateral basis, and that too is perfectly fine with President Trump. It is, in fact, his preferred construct for relations with other countries. And America's bilateral alliances with Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand remain strong and intact and have largely been free of the same kind of pressures that our European allies have endured. As for what to expect from the United States on security in the years ahead, I think it will pretty much look just like it does now. Of course, the United States will want its Pacific allies to share the burden of regional security, especially through increased spending on their own defense needs. And unlike Europe, where it took Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine to finally catalyze European resolve, it can be hoped that America's allies in Asia know full well the threat that looms just over the horizon in China. The main concern should not be the policies of the United States of America, but rather the timetable of China. But I'll leave China to the discussion that Michael and I will have following these remarks. Finally, the question of security is very much a derivative of my point on alliances. One of the huge multipliers of military deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is our commitment to mutual defense. To quote one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, "We can hang together or we can hang separately." That goes for the United States as much as it goes for Australia or for any other ally in this part of the world. For a decade and a half, the United States has been debating a pivot to Asia, through which the United States would shed some of the burdens of defending European security in the Middle East in order to devote more resources to Asia. And for a decade and a half, America has failed to meaningfully achieve this objective. There has never been a U.S. administration more inclined to do so than this one. And yet, in the short run, they too find themselves bogged down in an inherited proxy war in Europe and with a new war raging in the Middle East. But as much as they may seem distracted today, in the long run, these conflicts may actually create an even stronger impetus for the Trump administration to finally pivot the United States away from other theaters in order to focus on Asia. There's no question, coming out of the war with Iran, the United States military will have significantly depleted the very capabilities necessary to deter, and if deterrence fails, to defend our allies in this region, especially from China. As such, it may be that this current expenditure of America's capabilities will only add urgency to exiting commitments in Europe and the Middle East. President Trump's approach to trade and security may feel new and disruptive, but high tariffs and American predilections to separate themselves from the quarrels of other nations are historic themes that can be found woven through 250 years of American experience. There is nothing new. Just as these ideas have at times advanced, at other times they have receded, often in the aftermath of catastrophic events like the Great Depression of the 1930s or World War II, a quarrel that many Americans once similarly thought we could stay free of. For 80 years, the international institutions and alliances that formed in the aftermath of World War II have delivered to us and to much of the world an unprecedented era of security, peace, and liberty. And we know the value of the prosperity that has come from trading more freely with other nations. Those older grievances, built around a nostalgia for a different time, will again inevitably run headlong into the cold reality of diminished prosperity, greater dangers, and weaker democracies, and will give birth potentially to the same risks that preceded World War I and World War II in a previous century. I wonder if historians will look back at this moment as an inflection point. While it has yet to match the drama and crisis of previous periods of transformational change, I think we all sense that something significant is happening around us. Changing patterns of economic and military power in the world, major wars in Eastern Europe and the Persian Gulf, the rise of China, and the fraying of traditional institutions and alliances. Perhaps with the passage of time, this will be understood as the end of something old, something that is no longer fit for purpose in today's world, and that the post-World War II institutions and relationships have simply outlived their usefulness. I'm not convinced. And some, particularly China, and perhaps even some here among our friends in Australia, may have concluded that America is in decline. They're wrong. America's greatest strength throughout our history has been our ability of self-renewal. That is the superpower behind the idea of America. We are blessed with strong democratic institutions and a fiercely free people. We are infinitely capable of self-renewal, and we may be in the very process of that right now. We have within our means the ability to modernize, to improve, even to reconceive the world around us and our place in it. If I had one last appeal that I would make to any who think otherwise, it would be this: don't give up on us, because we certainly have not given up on ourselves. Thank you.
That was a great conversation starter. Thank you very much. And I love the story of your family, which I didn't know. And maybe I'll start there. And what I might do is I'll probably ask half a dozen or a few more questions about some of the topics that Steve raised. I do want to get into Iran a little bit. And then I'm going to come to you guys and we have some microphones. So please start thinking about your questions now. We have half an hour or so for discussion. But let me start where you started, of this incredible social mobility that was possible in your country that many people believed became impossible, and that President Trump noticed and took advantage of. Some might say exploited. Some might say he saw the truth before others did. He has put in place now, he's had 2 goes at making America economically great again. You've listed, the imposition of tariffs, the pressure on foreign countries to invest in American manufacturing, the pressure on companies to do that as well. Is it working, Steve? You said that you referred to the injured, the neglected, and the ignored. I think you said briefly tariffs haven't vindicated the worst predictions of the economists, but neither have we seen much progress. But talk a little bit more about that as a son of Detroit. All this effort, all this thought, all these policies, to what extent are they making America economically great again?
We have thank you, Michael. We have a very small window to make these judgments by, in the consequences of policy decisions of this magnitude, whether they're good or bad outcomes, will only appear after years of practice. As I mentioned a moment ago, there is no evidence that they have produced the catastrophe that so many economists predicted. We haven't seen at least a dramatic uptick in inflation. We'll probably see more inflation as a result of of the effect of energy prices on the war in Iran than we did for all the tariffs the president imposed in his first year in office. We have managed to still sustain a healthy, robust growth in the U.S. economy, and employment numbers are steady, and job creation has been relatively healthy. But you're only as good as your last set of data too. So we'll see. We're 1 year into the president's second term, and the steps he's taken in the second term have been far broader and far more in excess than what he did in the first term. So perhaps we will have enough data to make the judgment. But I want to emphasize something I also said is that I'm always careful myself to succumb to the appeal of nostalgia. I think when you start down that road, you really need to exercise deep analytical rigor, because going backwards, we all know that going backwards is not possible, and is rarely a good idea in anything to move backwards. But what I said about making these disputes obsolete is that we're already on to the next problem. The problem isn't going to be the hollowing out of manufacturing or fair or unfair trading practices and by the way, you can't lay all this at the feet of trade. Some of it is automation, modernization, the rise of capacity in other economies that are competitive. But just as we're kind of relitigating those issues from this period of unconstrained globalization from 2000 to 2015, the issue that we're facing is artificial intelligence that's going to penetrate every element of our economy, and it's going to simultaneously produce another wave of enormous wealth and potentially huge inequities. The productivity is going to go up and jobs are going to go down. GDP is going to go up and wages are going to go down. It will produce these contradictory effects that it could equal or even surpass the challenges that produce these political discontents of our era today. And so if I had my answer to your question is, it may or may not work, but it may not be the problem.
When I look at the Republican Party today, it's not your granddaddy's Republican Party. On issues like tariffs, for example, because of the weight of President Trump's popularity, because of the force of his personality, he has really shifted the centre of the GOP on issues like tariffs, but not just that, on personal behaviour, on the way a president should behave in public, on alliances is one of the issues you mentioned. When I was growing up as a young analyst, it was Republicans who were strongest on alliances. To what extent, let me ask you as a lifelong Republican, to what extent is the shift that President Trump has caused within the GOP and the shift in position, to what extent is that permanent? We often say, will America snap back after President Trump? Will the GOP snap back after President Trump? Do you see it going back to where it was 15, 20 years ago, or is that all over now? Will his effect be profound and long-lasting even after he leaves office? Yeah. So to your question, is this my grandfather's Republican Party? No, this is my grandfather's Democratic Party, and that underscores a bigger point. There is nothing in the portfolio of policies or behaviors even of President Trump that is impossible to trace back to a particular period of American history, maybe many periods of history before my grandfather, but going back to the origins of our country. America's reluctance to get involved in the quarrels and entanglements, get entangled in the quarrels of other countries. George Washington, that was in his farewell address to the American people.
that we should avoid alliances, we should be avoid being drawn into the conflicts of other countries. That's not our business. On trade protectionism, the protectionists in trade were the Republican Party. It was the agrarian economies of the Democratic Party in the southern states of the United States that advocated for free trade. It was the wool mills and the textile mills in the north, in the Republican part of the United States of America, that most objected to free trade because it undermined their competitiveness. The farmers wanted to sell to the world because they had scale. In immigration, in the polarization of the society, in the less commendable political behaviors of our leaders. I mean, if you haven't read the biography of Alexander Hamilton, it's riveting, but it's especially interesting about how each of the leading figures in the founding of our nation acquired their own newspapers to employ yellow journalism against each other, using the singular means through which information was communicated at the time to sully each other's reputations and to attack their opponents. I welcome you to the modern internet and social media today. You know, none of this is new. It feels uncomfortable to us because we have forgotten how much of this is part of our history. And, you know, for my part at least, I don't consider a lot of that to be the, you know, parts of our history that we would want to see our leaders emulate today, or behaviors we'd like to see them emulate today. But it's not new, Michael. You can trace it back to our history. I'm not sure President Trump knows that, to be honest. Although sometimes he does cite something, the Panama Canal or maybe Greenland or something like that. You know, he's the fourth United States president to try to acquire Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. As much as it's a shock to our senses to see what played out early this year, there's a fourth president that tried to do that in some way, shape, or form. The others simply tried to buy it outright, in fairness. So what comes next? You know, this is the part that gets me most excited, not pessimistic. I mean it. In observers of America who don't have a vested interest in it, like myself, have reflected the same thing that you heard me say a moment ago. America has an infinite ability at self-renewal. Our democratic institutions are sound. Our elections are going to be fine. And our people are fiercely free. And they're, unfortunately, all have guns too. So America's not going anywhere. America's going to work its magic, and whatever comes next, you know, I'm actually more excited than not about it.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a follow-up on that, because you've cited a lot of precedents which are interesting, but a lot of them are very old. I think the last president to try to acquire Denmark, for example, was President Truman, if
Correct.
I'm right.
1952.
Right, and you're talking about the behaviours of American presidents a long time ago, but I asked you a smaller, narrower question. Mm-hmm. The GOP at the moment, there are a lot of senators and congressmen who don't agree with elements of MAGA, who don't really identify with President Trump, but they have to follow their interests, and they know how powerful President Trump is. So my much narrower question is, what happens in 5 or 10 years to those kinds of Republicans? Do they revert to their previous instincts, or has he changed the weather such that to appeal to Republican voters in the future, big elements of MAGA-ism are going to have to continue? Yeah,
so I'm sure that there's some significant element of this moment that's just the president's personal style and charisma, and so absent that, can there be Trumpism without Trump, is a question that is asked by people who ask that question. It also depends, of course, on who succeeds him, and also, you know, this may not all end well, so we'll see. I couldn't tell you today. It's probably the case that any sort of shift in American politics will not be all at once. That it'll be gradual. I think President Trump's critics in America, the people who wouldn't support him, were kind of hoping for in one fell swoop we could have an election and everything would be washed away. And I think many allies who were unhappy with some of the attributes of this administration probably felt the same, but they don't now. And I think large countries, or a country of 330 million people, occasionally we have elections that are a complete reversal of the status quo. The last one we had, probably 1994. So we've had one in the last 30 years, a little slightly more than 30 years. These kind of elections do happen occasionally, where somebody gets their clock cleaned. And I actually think that would be a good thing for our country too. Is one of the things, and this is afflicting the entire Democratic West, including your country as well, is that our politics have kind of become 50-50. And it creates this grinding friction at the center of the politics between parties that have enough of a majority to govern but not enough to assert their will. And democracy has to function in every flavor, with minority governments, with coalition governments, with majority governments. But there's a certain clarity about a democratic polity coalescing around a single leader. Now, there are a lot of things in my country that are frustrating that. Politicians, for reasons that also support underscore your question about politicians who act in a certain way they don't believe because to do otherwise would potentially risk their election. Politicians too often seem focused exclusively on being reelected for its own sake, or to even have power for its own sake, but not to do something or do something good with it. In our system in the U.S., they have so atomized the electorate that they've created bespoke districts or ridings or whatever you call them in Australia, that to quote a former president, allow politicians to pick their voters rather than to allow voters to pick their politicians. In a very unwelcome turn of events. I have a confirmed belief that the way we consume information has also atomized our societies. Social media has allowed people to retreat to echo chambers that reinforce their views and simultaneously stimulate and aggravate them in ways that almost seem to become addictive. And that makes it very difficult for society to coalesce. A wave election, that's what they're called in political science, a wave election has these obstacles to it. But I think that would be a cathartic moment for any democracy right now. I mean, just think about the Democratic West. Canada, UK, France, Australia. I don't know about New Zealand, but everyone is struggling with this same phenomena of 50-50 politics.
All right, I'm going to ask two more questions, and then I'm going to come to the audience. So I want to ask you about China, and I want to ask you about Iran. We know that President Trump is heading to Beijing soon. He was meant to be heading around now. I think he postponed that because of the Iran war. What does he want to achieve on that visit? What does he think of Xi Jinping? What's his desired settling point in Washington's relationship with the PRC?
The president wants a deal, an economic deal specifically, and that economic deal, I think it's very unlikely that it will seek to address deep structural challenges that have challenged all of our economies not just out of malice, but just because of the sheer scale of China. It's so big. China, I At Ford Motor Company, I was responsible for designing our trade strategy. And as I looked through the history of trade policy, there's nothing that China's doing that hasn't been done by other countries, stealing technology, setting ownership restrictions on investors, things like that are relatively new. What's new is it's never been done by a country this big. And that makes it a special kind of problem. Like we could tolerate it if a small nation in Southeast Asia had the same policies, we'd almost not notice. But when it's a country with the magnitude of China, it's everybody's problem. And whether that's fair or unfair, it's something that really needs to be addressed if we're going to create a stable and balanced global trading system. And this is not on the table. It's going to be, I think we can pretty much guess what the contours of an economic deal will be between the United States and China. It's going to be a large purchase of agricultural goods. It's going to be a large purchase of manufactured goods, and it's going to be some commitments on easing market access for American investors. Interestingly, in the case of China, it appears that the one thing that won't be in it, that's been in all these other agreements that have been negotiated, is a commitment by China to invest massive sums in the United States of America, because views on China have become so hostile in the United States today that would lead to a backlash, if not at the federal level. You don't want their money. If not at the federal level, Michael, at the local level in the communities. President Trump wants an economic deal. The only thing that I think in this that is debatable is whether the Chinese give it to him all at once or portion it out over the next 3 years to keep the negotiation going, to keep the United States tied in this engagement. From the Chinese point of view, it's also interesting. Certainly the Chinese tactics are obvious. They wanted to start a negotiation quickly. They want to end it slowly. They want this thing to last 4 years if they could. But at a certain point, they risk a backlash from the president if he feels like he's being diddled along by the Chinese. And so they have to calibrate that on their own. And COVID-19, for example, turned the president harshly against China. There could be some exogenous event like that. And so, for the Chinese, it's a bit of a careful game too. The question I don't know about the Chinese view is, are they just looking to buy 3 years apiece, or are they looking to create a more stable foundation in the relationship so that between the United States and China and ultimately other countries, we can rebuild a period of greater collaboration and cooperation in international relations? Time will tell. And I kind of have a guess on which side this argument comes down, but I think that's where we are with China.
All right. Last question on Iran. There's been a series of statements from the president in the last 24, 48 hours. He's more or less declared victory. He's also said there has been a regime change in Tehran because a lot of the old regime is being killed. What's your best guess tonight, Steve, about how and when this war will end?
Yeah, just by way of backdrop, there is a feature of President Trump's decision-making that is unprecedented. He is the most transparent decision-maker that has been in the White House in my entire career. He makes these decisions in public, on full display. It's sometimes a little bit unsettling, but the old saying that never watch the sausage being made. He just makes it right out there in public. He'll throw a position, sometimes an extreme position out there. He'll retreat. He'll zig and he'll zag. Sometimes he'll drop it all together. Sometimes he'll double down. Kind of a decision-making process of sorts, but all on public display. You see it all. And never more so than, no better example than the Iran war that started, just 23 days ago, where the president has laid out various objectives, circled around kind of what the priorities are, advocated for regime change, then declared regime change. Where does he settle in the end? I'm not sure, but whatever it is, I guarantee you one thing: he's going to declare victory, no matter what. Now, what would be a reasonable victory would be the permanent disablement of Iran's ability to pursue a nuclear weapon, the degradation of Iran's ability to produce ballistic missiles capable of reaching its many neighbors in lands even far beyond Iran. And the third would be to deter them from future efforts to destabilize other nations in the region through the fomenting funding and training of proxy organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi in Yemen, the Shia militia groups, etc. Those would be clearly understood as elements of a decisive victory. And in the judgment of President Trump that was in his first social media post the night this war began was that could only be done by changing the government in Iran. That it wasn't, the problem wasn't the nuclear weapons program. You could negotiate that until you're blue in the face. The problem was that the regime would never give it up. And so you got to change the regime. That's the hypothesis. Now, that, I don't know what the what will be, but the win, in that initial comment on social media, he said 4 to 5 weeks, and I think that's what he's thinking. And I think there's a lot of reasons supporting that. He wants to get on with other business, the meeting with China, for example, the meeting with General Secretary Xi Jinping, and he's pushed that just a couple weeks into April, but he wants to get back to that meeting. We've got an election in the United States of America this fall. He wants this, he will want this war done and dusted long before that election comes about, long before voters start making their decisions on who they're going to vote for. And the world has a timeline here too that will impose itself upon President Trump, because the interruption of energy supplies coming through the Straits of Hormuz are painful, but they reach an absolutely acute and irreversible level in about 2 or 3 weeks. And so if I was a betting man, I'd bet around the beginning of April, we're going to see the president define what victory is, and he's going to try to use that defined victory as the end of the war. He's got one challenge though, which is the Iranians get a vote in this too, and so that is the wild card. What do the Iranians want? And that I can't predict.
All right, so let's get through a bunch of questions. I'm going to go in the order that I've seen them. First Susanna, and then the lady in this corner. So if you can just wait for a microphone, give us your name and ask a short question. Thanks. You, Susanna.
Susanna Patton. My question is about big cuts at the US State Department, also hollowing out of the NSC, cuts to other US agencies. As a former Deputy Secretary of State, what impact, if any, do you think these will have on American statecraft?
Why don't you have a go at that
one
question?
At a time? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, and so, and I was Executive Secretary of the National Security Council, so I was the Chief Operating Officer, so I know both buildings well. Both were in huge need of cuts, and both are in huge need of reforms. They had become sprawling and ineffective entities. But that's not what happened. What happened was vandalism. It wasn't a reformer's approach, it was an arsonist's approach to the State Department and National Security Council staff. Now, because of the unique way that President Trump governs and makes decisions, the impact of that is going to be less than might be expected, because he wouldn't have listened to those people anyway. And so, at the State Department every day, people show up for work and they do their memos and they receive their cables from the embassies and they debate policy and they make recommendations, and then it doesn't connect. There's no connection to the decision making. Now, that's not at all to diminish the very important role that Secretary of State Marco Rubio plays. He's incredibly important to the president, and he can bring his own expertise and acumen. But the National Security Council staff, likewise, isn't going to present President Trump with 5 policy options and here's the best and he'll take it. It's not his style. He's got a supreme confidence in his own ability and judgment. He operates based upon his gut, and if you work as a policymaker inside that framework, then what you have to do is develop practical ways to use the president's impulses and initiatives, not to contradict him. The American people elected him president. He's the president, And none of this is about undermining the president. It's about finding ways to give him the best possible options to achieve the outcomes that he's seeking to achieve. And in those cases, there's often many different approaches that can be taken, depending on one's perspective. And that's where the real policy making comes. It's kind of after he's decided, the policy debate is about how to execute it.
Madam.
Hi, Stephen. So, as an outside observer, it can be a little hard to believe that America today still maintains strong democratic institutions, but I appreciate your optimism. In this sense, you have referred to America's infinite ability for self-renewal. How do you define self-renewal, and in your opinion, what tools or prerequisites must be present for self-renewal to be successful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's. I do think it's a objective fact that these institutions remain strong, whether it's our courts, our Congress. I will distinguish Congress from congressmen or congresswomen, but the institution is wholly intact and will be capable regardless of any twists and turns in the people inside them. That's a great question, because it's not all institutions and elections, and I think we understand that more today than we perhaps have in a long time in our country. There's also such a thing as democratic culture that's not written into the Constitution. It's not guaranteed by laws, and it's not even necessarily derived from the institutions. A democratic culture is Michael, in your introductory remarks, you quoted John Gaddis's point about hegemonic consent. There's also democratic consent. It is a willingness in society to be respectful of the views with which you do not agree. It's the sense of obligation in a democratic society to accept that the election may not go your way, to be gracious and appreciative of the fruits of democracy, especially when you lose the election, because that's why democracy works. And so those are the cultural and even the personal attributes of democracy that allow us to use all those other great, well-engineered systems and institutions to do what we've done across generations, which is recover, renew, regenerate. And I'm not saying that we have anything at the current moment that requires us to go into some deep process of renewal. I think there's plenty to like about this moment too, and some people love it, and that too is the right of people in a democratic society. I just don't accept. What I really hate is this argument of American decline, and that's really what I'm juxtaposing my views against, is I just do not accept that, and perhaps it's because I'm an American. I'll concede that fact. But I think history has proven that that's not the case, and history will again prove that's not the case.
I'm going to squeeze in two more questions, and I'm going to go to the two people I saw first. I'm sorry. So this gentleman here, and then this gentleman over here.
Hello.
Sorry.
Hello, my name's Corey Alpert. Just for context, I served in the Biden White House from the transition until basically after APEC in 2023. My question is how you see the relationship between the Trump administration and Silicon Valley. This is something that, the Obama administration was often very close in a sort of civil libertarian way with Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg. That's now really shifted on its head. The CEOs of the major companies were sitting in the rotunda at Trump's inauguration. How do you characterize that relationship? What does that relationship mean, especially in context of the United States relationships with the world?
And
Thanks.
we will take I'll ask you to take both final questions at once.
Great, thank you. Alistair Scarf, I look after geopolitical risk for Bank of America in Asia. My question is more looking at the China-US-European relationship and how trade will play out there. On the US side, you have companies driven by profit motivations and driven by shareholder needs, whereas China obviously has different motivations. So if we look at the most recent 5-year plan and the doubling down of these industries of the future, how does US in this period of change and reform and revitalisation really compete against a country which will favour throw capital after bad capital and then export their way, particularly when you've got a country like, or a region like Europe, which just can't get its act together?
Yeah, it's interesting because there actually is a connection between your two questions. I think you heard it too, right? From some of the earlier discussions we have. We are in a I think everyone knows here we're in a huge competition here for these technologies, quantum computing, fault tolerant quantum, artificial intelligence, expanding new capabilities into space, not to mention all the enablers, silicon chips, critical minerals, et cetera. It's a huge competition here. And competition does have a strong economic element, but it also has a very strong national security imperative. To imagine a world in which fault-tolerant quantum computing powers artificial intelligence that is capable of performing it multiple times superior to a human thought, and not having that capability, but having a potential adversary have that capability, is really shaping the thinking in Washington. And so, there's a multitude of views about what level of regulation, how to moderate content, how to prevent misuse of these technologies, and there's certainly ample judgment on the record of some of the potential dire outcomes that could come from these new technologies, not just from outside, but from within societies. And we already are getting taste of some of these. But that national security imperative, combined with the economic imperative of mastery of these technologies, has led in the Trump White House to a complete surrender on any idea, any intention of regulating these technologies. It is the Wild West. The only limit is what you can do, not what you should do. And many of the people in the senior positions, directing policies around those industries come from those very industries themselves. But they have behind them a lot of energy and support because of that combined economic and national security imperative. There are exceptions to the case, but I am, as a lifelong transatlanticist, I'm sad to say that Europe is not even part of the consideration. I mean, that's the reality. There are some good, strong competitors in Europe, but Europe as an entity versus China or the United States isn't even the same league. This is a US-China competition. Australia, interestingly, has some huge contributions to making this space, not only in the technology space, but in the enablers space. And this is actually a promising area of cooperation, even in this era of roiled trade and economic relationships. This is really a promising area for US-Australian cooperation, and one that's rapidly evolving even today. I think a combination of self-interest by the technology companies from Silicon Valley, their self-image, because I don't want to generalize too much here, but I will a little bit. They don't view themselves constrained by the normal sovereign limits of government or countries. The technology sector has become a power in and of itself, a superpower even. It is a new geopolitical entity that's unconstrained by borders, and it doesn't believe it should be constrained by regulation either. It's a big battle. It happened here. I watched this as it played out about your children and their ability to access social media. And the whole world watched this, incidentally. You all probably, think everybody's watching us and what's going on in our country, but we were all watching Australia during that debate, because we all know, all of us with children know, that this is not good what's happening to our kids. And we're all trying to figure out what to do about it. But right now, the answer in the United States is nothing. Do nothing about it. And that's created a real clash between the federal government at the federal level, which is distant from those day-to-day concerns, and local and state governments, which hear them up front and close from the angry parents who've had a child portrayed in a pornographic video, or who have a business or a product or a artistic product that has been stolen and monetized by somebody else through the use of technology. So there's a real rub at the federal versus state level in the United States right now, and there's so much so that the federal government is trying to preempt the ability of the states to regulate. So this whole idea of just giving the freest possible hand to Silicon Valley does have political implications, as does, I talked about that aggrieved, injured constituency that President Trump connected so deeply with. But that same sense of injury will come from people whose jobs are displaced by artificial intelligence. And you were asking about you were treating our politics as a linear, permanent state where a Republican Party is a Republican Party, but this coalition, this is a momentary thing. And it's another important thing I should add, is President Trump governs with a coalition. It's a coalition of Democrats who left the Democratic Party, of traditional Republicans who on balance prefer Trump to Biden, Trump to Hillary Clinton, and then the MAGA voters, which are a plurality, and independents too, who can really blow with the wind. Holding that coalition together is quite an undertaking, and I'm not sure any president could, even one with formidable showmanship and political skills as President Trump has displayed, could do that. Anyway, I'd kind of digress there, but I hope I answered both your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, one of the initiatives and projects that the Institute is very well known for is public opinion polling, and each year we publish the Lowy Institute poll. We're in the field at the moment, so I don't have any results. I can't give you any leaks. I will give you a spoiler. It's unlikely that President Trump is going to do well in the Lowy Institute poll. I'm sorry to break.
Who's your polling population? Australians or?
Australians, yeah, Australians. He doesn't travel well. It's not only in Australia that he doesn't travel well, but America will poll well, and the Alliance will poll well, because they almost always poll well in the Lowy Institute poll. And I think if we were in the field with people who'd interacted with Steve Biegun on his trip, Steve Biegun would also be polling well in the Lowy Institute poll. Oh, yeah. And the reason is, I think you've seen it tonight, that he's very thoughtful, very intelligent. He has his views, he's very respectful, he doesn't engage in ad hominem attacks on President Trump or anybody else, but he answers questions honestly and intelligently and really tries to engage with them. So we're very much enjoying having Adelaide and Steve with us. I want to thank you for coming out on a day in which Melbourne lived up to its reputation of 4 seasons in one day. So thank you for braving whatever weather happened to be outside in the last couple of hours. So thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking Steve Biegun.